I was sitting in a chair by the window when the mail arrived. It was a quiet evening, the sky over Fitchburg slowly darkening behind the glass, the streetlights just beginning to flicker on and off along the street. I tore open the envelope with the logo of the Seattle Engineering Company and unfolded the letter, running my eyes over the lines. A proposal to consult on a new bridge across the bay, a large-scale and complex project that requires verification of the calculations of the main span's load-bearing structures. The fee is $350,000. The terms are negotiable. They are ready to adjust to my schedule and send all the technical documentation in any convenient format. I put the letter on the table next to my chair, mentally calculating what data I would need to analyze. It's an interesting project. I'll have to study the drawings carefully, especially the load-bearing cables and the load distribution on the anchor supports. I'll answer tomorrow morning, I decided. Now it's late, and I just wanted to sit in silence, not thinking about work. It was finally dark outside the window, and the house was completely quiet, with only the refrigerator humming monotonously somewhere in the kitchen. I poured myself some whiskey from a decanter that had been on the shelf for 10 years, maybe even more, and returned to the armchair, leaning back against the soft backrest. I had a good house. I bought it 20 years ago when I finally realized that there was and will be money, that the consultations bring enough to live comfortably and not count every dollar. Not a mansion, of course, but a good place with 3 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a study on the second floor, where I usually worked on projects, analyzing the cent drawings and calculations. The furniture is of high quality. A leather sofa in the living room, a comfortable armchair in which I was now sitting. In the kitchen, good appliances, which I chose myself and did not spare money, because I understood the price of reliability. Upstairs, a comfortable wide bed on which I slept without back pain, which can happen when you save money on a mattress and buy the first one. Nothing superfluous, no marble trim, gilded faucets, or designer things that only collect dust and have no meaning. Everything was well thought out, reliable, comfortable for living. It was enough for me. I took a sip of whiskey and remembered Roxy coming over the night before last. Granddaughter, 21, a student who'd changed her major 3 times in the last 2 years. She arrived around 7, walked into the living room, and plopped down on the couch across from me. "Grandpa, hi," she said, pulling out her cell phone and immediately looking at the screen. "Hi, Roxy. How are things going at the university?" She looked up, as if remembering why she'd come. It's okay. We're doing a group project right now, you know. It's a presentation on the effects of social media on the psyche. The deadline's in a week, and half the group isn't doing anything at all." I nodded, half listening. Roxy went on for about 15 minutes about classmates, about how someone hadn't done their part, about some conflicts in the group chat room. I encouraged her with short phrases. "I see. Yes, it can be hard. You'll get through it." Then she stopped talking, looked at me with that special expression on her face that I've learned to recognize over the years. "Grandpa, can you lend me $300? I need textbooks for the new course." I silently pulled out my wallet, counted out $300 bills, and handed them to her across the table. I knew perfectly well that the money would be spent on anything but books, and I would never see them back. But I didn't argue. What was the point? "Shuri, thank you so much." Roxy quickly slipped the bills into her bag without looking me in the eye. "I'll pay you back as soon as I get my scholarship." We both knew that wasn't true. She got up from the couch to leave, slinging her bag on her shoulder. She turned around at the door, as if she'd remembered something insignificant. "By the way, Dad's having a party the day after tomorrow. It's a promotion party. People from his company will be there. A buffet, the whole thing." I felt something squeeze inside me. The day after tomorrow is Thursday. Today's Tuesday. "The day after tomorrow, you say?" I paused. "Did he let me know?" Roxy faltered, looked away, clearly feeling uncomfortable. "I don't know, Grandpa. It's just that Mom told me there was going to be a party on Thursday. Maybe Dad was going to call you." "Maybe," I nodded, even though I already realized that no one was going to call. Roxy waved and left. I watched her stare out the window, watching her get into the beat-up car Clive had bought her a year ago and drive away without even looking back at the house. I remained seated in the chair, a glass of whiskey in my hand. I wasn't invited. Clive, my son, is throwing a career party, an important event in his life, and he hadn't even bothered to tell me about it. I found out by accident from my granddaughter, who mentioned it in passing, as if it were information about the weather or traffic. I looked at the phone that was on the table next to the letter from Seattle, decided it was a misunderstanding, some mistake or miscommunication. Maybe Clive really meant to call, but got caught up with preparations, with work, with organizing. Maybe he'd thought Roxy would extend the invitation in more detail. Stuff happens after all. I picked up the phone, unlocked the screen, found my son's number in my contact list, and pressed call. It rang. A long one. I almost thought he wasn't going to answer when, after the fifth ring, I heard his voice. "Yeah, Dad." A hurried tone, annoyed. I could hear voices in the background. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses and dishes. They were obviously having some kind of preparation. "Hey, son. Roxy came by to tell me about your promotion. Congratulations, that's great news." "Yeah, thanks." I sounded even more distant. "Listen, I'm kind of busy right now. We've got final preparations for Thursday. We've got a lot of stuff to check out. I'll call you later, okay?" "I'd like to come to the party," I said, trying to speak calmly and evenly. "To congratulate you personally, to be happy for your success." A pause, short but heavy, and I felt it like a blow under my breath. "All right, Tinar, there's no need, Dad, really." Clive spoke faster, the words coming out one after another. "It's all very formal here. The program is scheduled to the minute. The guest list is approved. The tables are set. It's more of a work event, you know? We'll definitely see you later, okay? We'll call next week, have a quiet sit-down talk. Clive, I'm your father." I felt my fingers tense as I held the phone. "I just want to shake your hand. Tell you I'm proud of you." "I get it, Dad. I appreciate it. I really do. But I really got to run now. A vet's calling. Something with the catering. Bye." "Bye." He's off. I stared at the phone screen, at the call completed sign that glowed in the darkness of the living room. Put the phone back on the table next to the glass. Sat in silence, listening as a car drove by outside the window, as the headlight slid down the wall of the room and disappeared into the darkness. This was nothing new, to be honest. Clive had always kept his distance between us for as long as I could remember. Back when he was at school, he didn't want me to come to parent-teacher conferences. He'd ask me to wait in the car in the parking lot, or better yet, not to come at all, so he could find out from the teachers and tell me later. I wrote it off as adolescence, thinking that he was embarrassed in front of his classmates, that he was shy about something, that all this would pass when he grew up and became more confident. It didn't. He grew up, graduated from university, married Priscilla, a woman with an iron grip and firm views on life and career. They bought a house in an upscale neighborhood, a house I suspected they could barely afford, judging by the way Clive stressed every time money or renovations were involved. Roxy was born. A girl grew up who saw her grandfather a couple times a year and thought of him as something of an ATM. I saw them infrequently, on big holidays like Christmas or Thanksgiving, and not always. Clive called a couple times a year, and the conversations were short, off the cuff. "How are you? I'm fine, I'm fine. Let's call each other some other day." And then we didn't talk for months. I got used to it over time. Got over it, I guess, decided to stay out of the way. I decided that he had his own life, his own worries, his own family, his own social circle, and there was nothing to impose, nothing to irritate with his presence. But now, sitting in the darkness of the living room with an almost empty glass in my hand, I felt something shrinking inside me, some bitterness rising. Not even anger, but a deep resentment, a dull ache somewhere beneath my ribs that couldn't be dulled or ignored. A promotion at work is an important event, a reason for joy, a moment that you want to share with your loved ones. I'm his father. I'm supposed to be there for him at such moments, to support him, to rejoice with him, to say something warm and important. But Clive doesn't want to see me. He's pushing me away like he's been pushing me away his whole life. And I don't even really understand why, what I did wrong, at what point everything went wrong when I lost my son. I got up out of my chair, walked across the room to the bookcase that stood against the far wall, under an old photograph of a mountain landscape. I looked at the picture frames on the shelf. Clive is small, about 5 years old, sitting on my shoulders in the park, smiling with a toothless mouth, spreading his fingers and showing them to the camera. Clive, the teenager at his high school graduation, wearing the suit we bought together at the Main Street store. Standing next to me on the steps of the school, me putting my arm around his shoulders, he smiles a little strained. Clive and Priscilla at the wedding, both in white and black, smiling for the camera. Me standing at the side, a little away from the newlyweds like a random guest. I was at that wedding, sitting almost in the last row, barely speaking to the guests I didn't know. Clive had introduced me to a few people very briefly. No details. My father, Edgar. And that was it. No stories, no warm words. I didn't say anything then. Didn't bother to clarify or ask uncomfortable questions. Kept silent as usual, as I'd been accustomed to silence all my life. I returned to the chair, sat down, and finished the rest of my whiskey. The decision was maturing slowly but surely. I'm going to this party anyway. I'll buy a good present, a decent, expensive one, so Clive can't say I came empty-handed. I'll come and congratulate him in front of all the guests, shake his hand, say a few warm words. He can't kick his own father out of the house in front of his colleagues and superiors after all. If he sees me, he'll realize that I came with good intentions. He'll soften, maybe even introduce me to someone important. I'm not asking for much. I just want to be there on this day, to share in my son's success. I put the empty glass on the table and looked out the window again, at the dark street, at the rare cars passing by. I thought about going downtown tomorrow morning, going to a good store, picking out something suitable. Clive has always liked expensive things, status things. I know that from the way he dresses, the car he drives, the neighborhood he lives in, the way his house is furnished. He works for an insurance company that evaluates large infrastructure projects, bridges, tunnels, dams. Serious work, serious money's involved. I understand that. It is important for him to look accordingly, to impress clients and partners. So the gift should be on the level, so that he sees that I understand that I respect his choice, his aspirations. I got up, turned off the light in the living room, and went upstairs to the bedroom. I undressed, got into bed, pulled up the covers. I lay in the dark, listening to the silence of the house, thinking about tomorrow. Thoughts swirled in his head, keeping him awake. Maybe a whiskey set, a quality crystal in a wooden case. Clive had mentioned once in passing that he wanted one, had seen it in a magazine or at a friend's house, or good cufflinks, silver, with some unobtrusive engraving. Something solid, something that would show that I hadn't skimped, that I'd taken it seriously. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to sleep. Tomorrow would be a long day. I'd have to go downtown, pick out a gift, come back, get cleaned up. And then the night after tomorrow, I'd go to Clive's house, congratulate him, and everything would finally fall into place. We'll talk like father and son. Maybe he'll even introduce me to some of his colleagues, show me that I'm not a stranger to him, that there's a bond between us that can't just be broken. I fell asleep with that thought, with a kind of stubborn optimism that was probably naivete. I woke up early, earlier than usual, though I had fallen asleep well past midnight the night before. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the fact that today was Wednesday and tomorrow night was Clive's party. I could still feel last night's resentment, and it hadn't gone anywhere overnight, but with it came a stubborn decision I was going to go, no matter what. Clive is my son, and I have a right to share this moment with him, no matter what he thinks about it. I got up, showered, and dressed in my usual house pants and shirt. I went downstairs, brewed some coffee in the kitchen, and toasted a couple pieces of toast. I ate slowly, taking my time, thinking about the plan for the day. First, he had to go to the center, to a good store, to choose a present. Then come back, clean myself up, prepare myself mentally. Tomorrow night I'd go to Clive's house, and I'd have a decent present with me so no one could say I'd come empty-handed. I finished my coffee and left the house through the back door that led to the garage. I hadn't been in here in a while, to be honest. It was a large two-car garage. I'd built it about 15 years ago when I decided it was time to get a proper place to store my car instead of leaving it outside in the rain and snow. I turned on the light, and the yellowish glow of the lamps revealed the outlines of two cars standing side by side. The first was an ordinary sedan, dark blue, reliable and unremarkable, about 7 or 8 years old. I bought it when the old car finally gave up. I chose it on the principle of reliability and economy, without any frills. I drove it rarely, mostly on business. To the store for groceries, sometimes to the doctor for a checkup, a couple of times a month, no more. The rest of the time I preferred cabs or walked at all, if the weather permitted. I didn't really need a car in everyday life, more like a backup, just in case. But the second car was a different matter. A limousine, black, long, with tinted windows and chrome parts that gleamed even in the dim light of the garage lamps. I stepped closer, ran my hand over the hood, brushed off a thin layer of dust. The car had been here for years, and I hadn't driven it once since they'd brought it here. Didn't see the point. Where would I drive a limo? To the store for bread? Doctor's appointments? It was a gift from the Turkish government, or rather from the management of the company that was building the Sanakal Bridge. I was working as a consultant on that project, checking the calculations of the main span load-bearing structures, and I noticed a mistake, a serious error in the calculations of anchorages, which could have led to a disaster. Not immediately, of course. The bridge would not collapse on the first day, but in a few years, when the load would reach a critical point, when thousands of cars and people would be on it, that's when everything could collapse. I wrote a detailed report, pointed out the problem, suggested a solution. They recalculated everything again, made changes to the design, strengthened the structure. The bridge was opened 2 years later, and it is still standing today, the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time. The Turkish engineers and officials were so grateful that they sent me this limousine, delivered right here in Fitchburg, with a driver and all the documents. The ceremony was solemn. They even came in person, handed me the keys, and said many warm words about my contribution to the safety of the project. I thanked, of course, accepted the gift, because it would have been impolite to refuse. But I never got behind the wheel. What would I, a retired engineer, do with a limo in a quiet town like Fitchburg? Draw attention to myself? Draw questions from the neighbors? I didn't need it. I'd never been a fan of showmanship, never sought to stand out from the crowd. But now, standing in the garage looking at this limo, I thought maybe it was time to use it. Not today, of course. Today I'll take a cab as usual. But maybe tomorrow, when I'll be driving to Clive's house for the party. Drive the limo up to his house, get out in front of the guests, show him and everyone else that his father wasn't some penniless old man who needed to be hidden from view. The thought warmed me, though it seemed a little vindictive, not my style. But why not, after all? I walked out of the garage, closed the door, went back into the house, grabbed my phone, called a cab through the app. The car promised to be here in 15 minutes. I put on my jacket, checked my wallet. My card was still there, and I had cash. I walked out onto the porch and waited, looking outside. The weather was overcast but not raining. The gray sky hung over the houses. The trees were almost bare, with the last of the yellow leaves still in some places. The cab arrived right on time, a plain gray car with a company sticker on the side. I sat in the back seat, said hello to the driver, and gave him the address. Downtown, the shopping district, where the expensive stores were located. The driver nodded, turned on the meter, and off we went. The drive took about 25 minutes, and I looked out the window at the familiar streets, at the people going about their business, at the storefronts, at the traffic lights and intersections. Fitchburg was a small town. I knew it almost by heart after living here for so many years. We arrived downtown. I paid the driver, stepped out onto the sidewalk. The shopping street was busy even on a Wednesday morning. People walking with bags, stopping at cafes, stopping at storefronts. I walked past several stores, choosing where to go. I stopped at a large store with a sign that read, "Luxury Gifts and Accessories," and looked at the window displaying expensive watches, pens, cufflinks, all sorts of status things for people with money. A suitable place, I decided, and pushed open the door. It was quiet inside, unobtrusive music playing, smelling of leather and expensive wood. Behind the counter stood the salesman, a man in his 40s in a suit, with a neat beard and an attentive look. He said hello, asked what he could do for me. I said I was looking for a gift for my son, something solid, for an important event. The salesman nodded, said he would show me a few options, and led me deeper into the store. We stopped at a glass display case where whiskey sets were displayed, crystal glasses, decanters, cases. The salesman began to talk about each set, the quality of the crystal, the country of production, how it would look on the table. I listened half-heartedly, considering the options. I settled on one: six massive glasses with faceted walls, a heavy decanter with a wide neck, all packed in a wooden case with a velvet lining inside. Solid, expensive, just what you need. How much is this set? I asked. Shimon, son. $850, he answered the seller without hesitation. This is handmade Czech crystal. Each glass is blown individually by a master. It's very high quality and will last for decades. I nodded. Expensive, of course, but not prohibitive. For me, this sum was not a problem. Consultations brought much more. And it's a gift for my son, for an important moment in his life. It's worth it. I'll take it, I said. Horn, please wrap it as a gift. The salesman smiled, said it was a great choice, that the recipient would be delighted. I remained silent, didn't bother to explain that I wasn't sure about the rapture, that I wasn't even sure they'd let me in the house at all. The salesman left for the warehouse, returned about 10 minutes later with a box neatly wrapped in gift paper with a gold ribbon. I paid with my card, took the box, heavy, solid, nice to hold in my hands. I left the store, stood on the sidewalk with the box in my hands, wondering what to do next. I could call a cab and go home, or I could walk around the center, have a coffee somewhere, take my time. But something was pulling me home. I wanted to go back, to put the present in a safe place, to prepare myself mentally for tomorrow. I took out my phone and called a cab. I waited for 15 minutes. The car was different, but the driver was just as silent and indifferent. I sat down, put the box next to me on the seat, gave the address. We drove back, and I looked out the window again, but I couldn't see the streets, thinking about tomorrow night, about how I would drive up to Clive's house, how I would walk in with this gift, how everyone would look at me. Maybe some of the guests would be acquaintances, people I'd crossed paths with at work. Clive, after all, works for an insurance company that assesses large projects. There are probably consulting engineers, architects, people from the construction industry. Maybe someone knows my name, has heard of my projects. We arrived. I paid, walked out with the box, walked to the house. I opened the door, walked into the hallway, put the box on the table by the entrance, stood looking at it, at the golden ribbon, at the neat packaging. Tomorrow night I will take this box, go to my son's house, and everything will change. We'll finally talk, the way a father and son should talk, without the distance, without the coldness that has separated us for so many years. I went into the living room and sat in my chair by the window, where I had been reading the letter from Seattle yesterday. The letter was still on the table, and I picked it up and reread it. $350,000 for consulting. Good money, a serious project. I'll have to answer them today, tell them I'm in, and have them send me the documentation. Work distracts me, helps me not to think about bad things, makes me feel needed. Bridges are being built. People need my knowledge, my experience, my ability to see what others do not notice. I opened my laptop, which was on a nearby table, wrote a response letter to the Seattle company. Short, businesslike. I agree to the consultation, ready to get to work, waiting for technical documentation and project details. I sent it, closed my laptop. I looked at my watch. It's only noon. I have all day ahead of me, and there's not much to do. I got up, walked around the house, looked in the office on the second floor, where I usually worked. The desk was piled with papers, drawings of old projects, books on engineering. I love this place. This is where I spent thousands of hours, where calculations were made, which then turned into bridges, into structures, connecting coasts, cities, countries. This is where I felt needed, useful, important. Not like in my relationship with my son, where I was always superfluous, inconvenient, out of place. I went back downstairs to the kitchen, heated up the remains of last night's dinner, and ate without much appetite. The day stretched slowly, and I tried to read a book, but I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept returning to tomorrow's party. I imagined the cab ride up, the entrance with the gift, how Clive would see me and what he would say. Would he be annoyed, embarrassed, or would he be pleased, even if not immediately? In the evening, I went to bed early, but again I couldn't sleep for a long time. I lay in the dark, listening to the silence, thinking that tomorrow everything will be decided. Either I will find a common language with my son, or I will finally realize that there is an insurmountable gap between us, which cannot be filled with any gifts and good intentions. Thursday began with rain. I woke up to the sound of drops drumming on the roof, looked out the window, gray sky, wet trees, puddles on the road. The weather suited my mood, I thought, getting out of bed. I'd been walking around the house all day, trying to keep myself busy, but my thoughts kept returning to the evening, to the party, to my upcoming meeting with Clive. I went over to the table in the hallway where the gift box lay, touching it, checking the ribbon, as if it might come undone by itself. Silly, of course, but my hands were reaching for it beyond my will. It was my pass to the party, my insurance, proof that I'd come for a reason, not empty-handed. By 6 p.m., the rain had stopped, but the sky remained cloudy. I showered, shaved extra carefully, put on a clean white shirt and dark pants. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked decent, even good for 72. His gray hair was neatly combed. His face was fresh after shaving. His clothes were without a single crease. No shame in showing myself to people, I decided, though there was still some anxiety, some uncertainty inside. I went downstairs, took the box with the gift, called a cab. The car promised to be here in 10 minutes. I went out onto the porch, stood under the awning, shielding myself from the small drops that were still falling from the sky. The cab pulled up right on time. I sat in the back seat, carefully holding the box in my lap, and gave the address. The driver nodded and pulled away. The drive to Clive's house took about 40 minutes. He lived in an upscale neighborhood on the outskirts of town, where the houses stood on large lots with manicured lawns and tall trees. I stared out the window, watching the scenery change from ordinary city streets to wide avenues with mansions on the sides. The closer we got, the harder my heart pounded, the more I questioned the decision. Maybe I shouldn't have come. Maybe I should have listened to Clive and stayed home, but it was too late to back out. We turned onto the street where Clive lived, drove past a few houses, and stopped at a familiar two-story mansion with columns at the entrance. I'd only seen the house a couple times. Clive hadn't really invited me over, and we usually met at neutral places like restaurants, if at all. I paid the driver and got out of the car, adjusting the box in my hands. There were several expensive cars in the driveway, lights streaming in from the windows of the house, soft music and voices. The party had already started. The guests had gathered. I walked down the driveway to the front door, up the steps to the porch. I froze for a moment, staring at the massive dark wood door, then pressed the bell. Footsteps sounded inside and the door opened. Clive stood on the threshold in a suit, a glass of wine in his hand, a smile on his face that instantly froze when he saw me. His face was literally petrified, the smile gone. His eyes widened in surprise, which was quickly replaced by something akin to horror. "Dad," he said quietly, almost in a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "Hi, son." I tried to smile, handed him the box. "I came to congratulate you. Brought you a present." Clive didn't take the box, didn't even look at it. He turned around quickly, glanced toward the back of the house where the voices of the guests were coming from, then looked at me again. His face was tense, panic in his eyes. "Wait here," he said, and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him so I couldn't be seen from inside. I stood there with the box in my hands, not sure what was going on. Clive set his glass on the porch railing, ran his hand over his face, and took a deep breath. "Dad, I told you not to come," he began, trying to keep his voice low, but I could hear the irritation in every word. "I made it clear that this was a work event, that we had everything planned out." "Clive, I'm your father," I repeated what I'd said on the phone. "I just want to congratulate you, to celebrate your success. I brought a present. Look." I handed him the box again, but he pulled away, as if I were offering him something dangerous. "I don't need a present," he said sharply. "I need you to leave, right now." I felt something inside me clench, bitterness rising to my throat. "Why?" I asked. "What did I do wrong? I just want to be there for you on this day." Clive looked at me. and in his gaze I saw something that hurt more than any words could. Shame. He was ashamed of me, of his father. "Look at you, Dad," he said quietly but firmly. "You came in a cab, in a plain shirt, with some box. There are people inside, important people. My colleagues, bosses, partners from big companies, engineers, architects, people who work on billion-dollar projects. Do you understand? Porchholm, I understand that you're ashamed of me," I said, feeling my voice grow deafening. "But why, Clive? What's so embarrassing about it?" He turned away looking at the road, at the parked cars, at anything but me. "You've been a simple man," he finally said. "You've built bridges, worked on construction sites, lived modestly. That's okay. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But I've made a career. I've risen higher. I work for a serious company. I have a reputation. And if they see that my father, that you—" He didn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need to hear the end. I got it. Clive thought I was a construction worker, a regular worker who carried rebar and mixed concrete. He never understood the difference between someone who builds bridges physically and someone who designs them, who creates the drawings themselves, who calculates every girder, every cable, every load. To him, I was just a man in dirty clothes and a helmet, someone to be hidden from decent society. "Clive," I began, trying to remain calm, "I didn't just build bridges. I designed them. I'm an engineer, a consultant. People pay me hundreds of thousands of dollars for—" "Enough, Dad," he cut me off, and there was a finality in his voice that took my breath away. "I don't want to talk about this right now. Just go, please. Leave before anyone sees you. We'll talk later. I'll call you next week, explain everything calmly. But right now, just go." He looked at me, and there was no warmth or regret in his eyes, only a desire for me to disappear, to dissolve, to cease to exist, if only for this evening. I stood on the porch of his house, holding an expensive gift he hadn't even bothered to look at, and I felt a wave of humiliation rising inside that I couldn't contain. "Are you serious?" I asked, and my voice sounded alien, somehow hoarse. Do you really want me to leave? Your own father would dishonor you with his presence?" Clive didn't answer, only nodded, quickly, sharply. Then he took his glass from the railing, opened the door, and stepped inside, leaving me alone on the porch. The door didn't slam shut. He held it open, waiting for me to turn around and walk away. I saw out of the corner of my eye him standing in the opening, tense as a string, ready to close the door completely at any moment. I looked at the box in my hands, the gold ribbon, the neat packaging. $850, handmade Czech crystal. The gift I'd chosen with such care, with such hope. I bent down and set the box on the porch step, careful not to crumple the paper. "Hold your present," I said quietly. "Maybe someday you'll open it and remember this moment." Clive didn't say anything. I turned and walked down the path away from the house, slowly, trying to keep my back straight, not to show how much it hurt. I heard the door close behind me, the click of the lock. I reached the road and stopped, not knowing what to do next. It was dark. The street was empty. The cars of the guests were silent, and the lights and laughter were still coming from the windows of Clive's house. I pulled out my phone, hailed a cab. The app showed that the wait would be about 20 minutes, the nearest available car far away. I stood on the curb in the drizzling rain that had started again and looked out at the mansion where my son was celebrating his success with people who were more important to him than his own father. 20 minutes stretched on interminably long. I was soaking wet. The rain had intensified, drops dripping down my face, down my hair. But I didn't even try to take cover, standing there thinking about the fact that I lost my son somewhere along the way, at some point that I can't even remember. Maybe it happened a long time ago, when he was a teenager and shy around me at school events. Maybe even earlier, when he was little and I was working too much, spending too little time with him. Or it happened later, when he married Priscilla and fell under her influence, her views on life, on success, on how people around him should be. Finally, the cab arrived. I sat in the back seat, all wet, shivering. The driver looked at me in the rearview mirror, wanted to say something but kept silent, apparently deciding to stay out of it. I gave him my address, and we drove back across town from the upscale neighborhood with the mansions to my quiet neighborhood, with the ordinary houses. The drive passed in silence. I stared out the window, seeing nothing, immersed in my thoughts. The humiliation I experienced today was somehow special, deep, leaving a mark. My own son threw me out of the door like a beggar, like an intrusive beggar. Wouldn't even let me in. Wouldn't even let me explain who I really was, what I had done with my life. We arrived, I paid, got out of the car, walked to the house. The keys were shaking in my hands. I couldn't get into the keyhole. I had to stop, take a deep breath, calm down. Finally, the door opened, and I walked into the hallway, took off my wet shirt, hung it on the rack. I went into the living room without turning on the light and sat in my chair by the window. Sat in the dark, listening to the silence of the house, thinking about what to do next. Accept it? Accept that I don't have a son, that the bond between us is finally broken? Or show him who I really am? I sat in the dark, in my wet pants, and felt the cold creeping into my bones. But I didn't want to get up, and I didn't want to turn on the light. I just wanted to sit there and digest what had happened, to try to understand how we had gotten to this point, when a son kicks his father out of his own house. Gradually, the shock began to recede, giving way to other feelings: resentment, bitterness, misunderstanding, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. Anger, I guess. Silent, cold anger at Clive, at his wife, at this whole situation that I was guilty of, even though I'd done nothing wrong. I got up from the chair, walked to the bathroom, stripped off the rest of my wet clothes, wiped myself with a towel. I put on my homemade pants and a warm sweater, went down to the kitchen, put the kettle on. While the water was boiling, I stood at the window, looking at the dark street, at the rare lights in the windows of neighboring houses. Normal people were having a normal Thursday night, having dinner, watching TV, talking to their families. And I stood alone in the kitchen, trying to figure out exactly where it all went wrong. The kettle was boiling. I made myself a strong tea, added sugar, though I usually drank without it. I needed something sweet, something to lighten my mood a little. I took the cup, went back to the living room, turned on the floor lamp in the corner. The soft light filled the room, making it cozy and warm. I sat down in the armchair and put my hands around the cup, warming my fingers. Thought about Clive, about his words on the porch. You built bridges, worked on construction sites, lived modestly. He really thought so. All these years he'd been convinced that his father was a simple laborer, one of those men in helmets and dirty clothes who hauled heavy loads on construction sites. And I suddenly realized where it came from. I remembered how, many years ago, when Clive had been a boy, about 11 or 12, he'd asked me at dinner what I did for work. It was a rare thing. Usually he wasn't interested in my work, living in his own childish world of school, friends, and games. But that night he asked, and I answered briefly, as I was accustomed to answering. I build bridges. I remember him nodding, saying, I see, and returning to his plate. I didn't go into detail. I didn't explain the difference between design and physical construction. I thought it was obvious that anyone would understand. When an engineer says, I build bridges, he means creating a design, calculations, drawings. But it wasn't obvious to a child. To a child, building a bridge meant physical work, digging, carrying, building structures with his own hands. And Clive grew up with that notion. He never saw my drawings, never took any interest in the details. I worked at my office upstairs behind a closed door, and he lived his life downstairs. We rarely talked about my work. I did not impose my professional interests on him. I thought that a boy should have his own hobbies, his own dreams. I didn't want to pressure him to follow in my footsteps, as some fathers do. But in the end, he didn't know anything about me at all. He didn't know anything about what I did, what my status was in professional circles, how much money I made. To him, I was just a quiet father who went to work and came home, lived modestly, didn't brag, didn't flaunt my accomplishments. And he concluded that there was nothing to brag about, that there were no accomplishments, that my father was just an ordinary loser who could barely make ends meet. I took a sip of tea, felt the hot liquid warming me from the inside. The anger was growing, but it wasn't the dull resentment that had come over me on Clive's porch. It was something else, a cold, calculated decision not to let things go. Clive worked for an insurance company that assessed the risks of large infrastructure projects. So there were people from that field in his party, consulting engineers, architects, construction estimators, people who should have known my name. Edgar Wolf is not an unknown person in narrow professional circles. My methods are taught in universities, my designs are referenced in textbooks, and I am invited to consult on billion-dollar projects. And Clive's guests must have been people who knew that, who had read my articles in professional journals, who had heard of my consulting work, who might even have crossed paths with me at conferences or in correspondence. And my son, who was so ashamed of me, didn't even realize it, didn't suspect that his working father might be a legend to some of his guests. I set the cup on the table, stood up, walked across the room. Thoughts were forming into a plan, bit by bit, brick by brick. Clive wanted me gone, so I wouldn't embarrass him in front of important people. All right, I'll disappear, and then I'll reappear, but in a completely different capacity. I went up to my office on the second floor, turned on the light. The desk was piled with papers, as usual. I found a folder with old clippings from magazines, articles that had been written about me and my projects. I opened it, flipped through it. Here's an article in the Journal of Bridge Engineering about the calculations of suspension structures, where I was quoted as an expert. Here's a mention in a piece on the world's largest bridges that mentioned my contributions to several projects. Here's a photo from a conference where I stood next to famous engineers from different countries. I closed the folder, thinking, I needed something more impressive, something that would definitely attract attention. And then I thought of Çanakkale, the Çanakkale Bridge in Turkey in 1915, the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time of its opening. The main span was 2,023 meters long. A grandiose project that cost several $billion. And I saved that project from disaster. I was invited there as a consultant at the final stage of construction when most of the work had already been completed. They asked me to check the calculations, to make sure that everything was in order, that the structure would withstand the declared loads. This is a standard procedure before handing over such facilities. Usually it is a formality. But I am not used to treating my work formally. I checked everything thoroughly, sat over the drawings for days, recalculated every node, every fastener. And I found a mistake, a small one at first glance, in the calculations of the main span anchorages. The safety factor was underestimated, and some dynamic wind loads, which are typical for this strait, were not taken into account. The bridge would have withstood normal operation, yes, but under certain weather conditions, with high winds and heavy traffic, there could have been a resonant vibration that would have caused the fasteners to collapse. Not immediately, of course. Not the first day, not the first year. But in a few years, when there would be thousands of cars, thousands of people on the bridge, that's when the catastrophe could happen. Collapse, casualties, international scandal. I wrote a detailed report, pointed out the problem, proposed a concrete solution to strengthen the anchors, to change the configuration of the hangars, to add additional dampers to dampen vibrations. The Turkish engineers were skeptical at first. The modifications required time and money and delayed the opening of the bridge. But I insisted, showed them the calculations, and explained the risks. In the end, they agreed, made changes, and strengthened the structure. The bridge was opened with a delay of several months, but it is still standing, safe and reliable. And I received thanks from the Turkish government, from the contractor's management, from the engineering community, in the very same limousine that still stands in my garage as a monument to an event my own son doesn't even know about. I returned to the living room, sat down in a chair, and finished my tea. The plan was forming more and more clearly. Tomorrow, no tonight. It was late at night. I wouldn't sit at home and worry. I'm going to show Clive who I am. I'll show him and all his guests that his working father is a man who is respected in professional circles, a man who saved a project worth billions, a man whose name is known by engineers all over the world. And I knew how to do it. I have a limousine in my garage, a gift from the Turkish government, a car I never used because I never saw the point. But now I do. I'm going to drive up to Clive's house in that limo, walk in there with my head held high, and have him explain to his guests why the father he's ashamed of is arriving in a car that was given as a token of the greatest gratitude. I got up, walked to the hallway, opened the door leading to the garage. I turned on the light, looked at the limo. Black, long, with shiny chrome. I'd have to see if it was in working order. I hadn't started it in a while, but it was an expensive car. It was serviced regularly, and I didn't forget about it, even though I didn't drive it. I'll do it tomorrow morning. I'll check the car, tidy it up, maybe even go to the car wash to make it shine like new. Then I'll buy something for the guests. Not for Clive, no, for his guests. Expensive wine maybe, or some souvenirs. Something to show that I didn't come to apologize, but to participate in the festivities as an equal. And I'm going back to that party. I'll go back when Clive least expects it. I'll go back and I'll show him the truth. I went back into the living room, lay down on the sofa before I reached the bedroom, covered myself with the plaid that hung on the back. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. My mind was spinning with thoughts, plans, memories. Clive's face on the porch, his look of shame, his words, "You'll embarrass me." The gift box left on the steps, but now there was something else attached to those memories. Anticipation, curiosity, a desire to see Clive's face when he realized who his father really was. When his co-workers, his bosses, his important guests would start greeting me, treating me with respect, asking me questions about my work. It was revenge, of course, I understood that. But didn't I have a right to it? After the humiliation I'd endured today, couldn't I afford a little justice? I lay on the couch, covered with a plaid blanket, and stared up at the ceiling. The clock read about midnight, and the party at Clive's was probably still going on, the kind of thing that usually went on late, with the guests leaving around 2 or 3 in the morning. I stood up and paced the room, feeling the determination growing inside me. If I wanted to do this, I had to do it now, while everyone was still there, before they went home. I went up to the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out my best suit, a dark blue one I'd bought 5 years ago for some conference and hadn't worn since. The suit was hanging in its case, ironed and ready. I took it off the rack, spread it out on the bed. The shirt was white, the tie dark maroon, the shoes black, polished. If you're gonna do it, you gotta do it right, with dignity. I took a shower, shaved for the second time that day, though the stubble was still barely there. I just wanted to look flawless, so no one could say I looked unkempt or sloppy. I wiped myself down, put on clean underwear, pulled on my shirt, buttoned it, taking my time, doing everything neatly. Then suit pants, jacket, tie. I fiddled with the tie in front of the mirror for a long time. I couldn't tie it evenly. My hands were shaking a little from excitement or fatigue. I couldn't understand why. Finally, the knot turned out decent. I corrected my collar, looked at myself in the mirror. I looked good. The suit fit perfectly. Despite the years in the closet, I hadn't gotten fat, hadn't shrunk. My figure was still intact. My gray hair was neatly combed, my face fresh from shaving, my eyes clear, though tired. I looked like a man to be respected, a man of dignity and standing in society, not like a working father who needed to be hidden from guests. I went downstairs, put on my shoes, got the keys to the limo. Then I remembered the presents. I need gifts for the guests, something decent to show that I didn't come empty-handed. But where can I get them at midnight? The stores were closed. The liquor stores were closed. I stood in the hallway wondering what to do, and suddenly I remembered a 24-hour supermarket on the outskirts, which is open without weekends. It had a wine department, not the most exquisite, of course, but a decent selection. I left the house, went into the garage through the back door. I turned on the lights, and the limousine was back in all its glory. Black, long, with chrome parts that gleamed even in the dim light of the garage lamps. I walked around the car, checking to make sure everything was in order. The tires were inflated, the body was clean, the windows were clear. The car looked like it had just come from the showroom, even though it had been here for years. I opened the driver's door, got behind the wheel, and settled into the soft leather seat. The interior smelled expensive leather, polished wood, some subtle scent that came from the upholstery. I put the key in the ignition, turned it, and the engine came to life on the first try, running smoothly and quietly, almost without sound. A good car, I thought, reliable even though it had been idle for so long. The Turks wouldn't give me junk. They'd given me a real quality item, worthy of the contribution I'd made to their project. I pushed the button to open the garage door, and it slowly crept up, letting in the night air and the light of the street lamps. I turned on the headlights, carefully reversed into the driveway. The limo was long, unusually long for me, and I was afraid I'd hit a gate jam or fence post, so I moved very slowly, literally 1 centimeter at a time. But everything went smoothly. I drove out, stopped, pressed the button to close the gate. The garage closed behind me, and I was left alone with the night street and my decision. I drove down the deserted streets of Fitchburg toward the supermarket on the outskirts. The city was asleep, with only the occasional car, traffic lights flashing yellow in nighttime mode. I drove the limousine carefully, getting used to its dimensions, to the way it reacted to the steering wheel, to the pedals. The car went softly, smoothly, almost silently, as if it was floating on the road, not driving. It took me about 20 minutes to get to the supermarket. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few cars parked at the entrance. I parked the limousine away from the others, took 3 spaces at once. I didn't want anyone to accidentally scratch it with a door or a cart. I got out, locked the car, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the entrance. Inside the supermarket was bright and empty. Quiet music was playing. A saleswoman was bored at the cash register, leafing through a magazine. I walked past her, headed for the wine section in the far corner of the hall. The shelves were filled with bottles of different shapes and colors. The price tags were full of numbers. I stopped, began to choose. I needed something decent, but not too flashy, something that would suit different people and not look cheap. I chose a French red wine, a decent brand I'd seen in restaurants. I took 15 bottles. That should be enough for all the guests in reserve. Then I went to the gift wrapping department, found beautiful bags of heavy paper with golden handles, and took the same amount. At the cash register, the saleswoman looked at me with curiosity. A man in an expensive suit buying 15 bottles of wine at midnight was probably unusual even for a convenience store. But she didn't ask me anything, just punched the goods and told me the amount. I paid with my card, collected the bags with bottles in a large shopping bag, which the saleswoman kindly gave me for free. I left the store, walked to the limousine, carefully placed the bag on the back seat so that the bottles wouldn't bump into each other. I got behind the wheel, started the engine, looked at the clock on the dashboard. 1:30 in the morning. The party at Clive's must still be going on, maybe in a more relaxed phase, when the official part was over and the guests were just socializing, drinking, talking about work and life. I drove out of the parking lot, headed across town to the neighborhood where Clive lived. On the way, I thought about what I would say when I walked in. Would there need to be any words, explanations, or just walk in silently with dignity, letting people get to know me for themselves? Probably the latter, I decided. Words could ruin everything, make the situation strained or awkward. But just showing up, calmly, confidently, with gifts in hand, would make an impression. I drove through the night streets, and with each passing minute grew not fear, but some strange calmness. This was the right decision. I shouldn't have left last night humiliated, shouldn't have accepted the way Clive had treated me. I had the right to show him and everyone else who I really was. Not for bragging rights, not for self-assertion, but for simple justice, for restoring the truth. The neighborhood was becoming more and more upscale, the houses more and more imposing. I turned onto Clive Street, drove past the familiar mansions, pulled up in front of his house. There were still cars of guests parked in the driveway, maybe a little less than yesterday, but most were clearly still inside. The windows were glowing, and I could hear music, muffled laughter, voices. The party was still going on. I parked the limo right out front, in the most prominent spot where it couldn't be missed. I turned off the engine, sat there for a few seconds collecting my thoughts. Then he opened the door, got out, adjusted his suit, smoothed out the non-existent creases in his jacket. I opened the back door, pulled out a bag of bottles and gift bags. It was heavy, but I could handle it. Closing the car, I heard the distinctive sound of the alarm. I stood in front of Clive's house holding the gift bag, dressed in my best suit, arriving in the limo given to me as a thank you for saving a project worth billions. I was ready to go in there and show everyone the truth. I walked up the porch steps, holding the bag of gifts in one hand. The box I'd left here yesterday was gone. Clive must have put it away, not wanting guests to see it and ask questions. I stopped in front of the door, took a breath, straightened my back. Then I pushed the doorknob, the door was unlocked, and guests were apparently still coming and going. I entered the spacious hallway, where the soft light of wall sconces burned. To the left was a closet with hanging coats and jackets, and to the right was a full-wall mirror in which I caught a glimpse of my reflection. I looked dignified, my suit fit well, my face calm, though inside my heart was beating so hard I could hear every beat. There were voices, laughter, clinking glasses, and soft music. Jazz, I think. I walked down the hallway toward the sounds, the bag of gifts tugging at my arm, but I held it tight. The corridor led me into a large high-ceiling living room where guests were gathered. 30 people, maybe a little more, all well-dressed, glasses in hand in small groups of 3 or 4. They were talking animatedly, gesticulating, laughing. I stopped in the doorway looking around the room. Clive was standing against the far wall, near the hors d'oeuvres table, talking to 2 middle-aged men in suits. He was holding a glass of wine, smiling, saying something, gesturing with his free hand. He looked relaxed, content, successful, just the way he wanted to look in front of his guests. Priscilla, his wife, stood nearby with a group of women, elegant in a black dress, a pearl necklace around her neck. I took a step into the room, then another. Several people standing closer to the door turned around at the sound of my footsteps. One of them, a man in his 50s with a gray streak in his neatly trimmed hair, looked at me curiously. Then his gaze slid to the bag of gift bags in my hand. "Good evening," I said softly, but clearly enough to be heard. A few more people turned around. The conversations began to die down, one group after another falling silent as they stared at the unfamiliar guest who appeared in the doorway. I could see their faces, curiosity, slight bewilderment, questions in their eyes. Who was this person? A late guest? Someone important? And then I saw Clive's face. He turned at the sound of my voice and his face was literally petrified. His smile froze, then slowly slid away, giving way to an expression that was hard to describe, a mixture of shock, horror, and utter incomprehension. The glass trembled in his hand, the wine splashing, almost spilling over the edge. He opened his mouth but didn't make a sound, just stood there staring at me as if I were a ghost. "Clive," I said calmly, stepping deeper into the room, "I'm sorry I couldn't come sooner. There were things that needed to be finished." He remained silent, looking at me with a paused gaze. Priscilla, who was standing nearby, also turned around, saw me, and her face took on a wary expression. She walked quickly over to her husband and touched his elbow. "Clive, who is it?" she asked quietly, but I heard her. Before Clive could answer, one of the men he'd just been talking to stepped forward, tall, gray-haired, in his 60s, wearing thin-rimmed glasses. He was staring intently at my face, as if trying to remember something important. "Pardon me," he said, coming closer, "but you're not Edgar Wolf?" I felt something inside me clench with satisfaction. Someone recognized. Someone knew my name. "Yes," I answered, looking at him. "I'm Edgar Wolf." The man's face lit up with a smile, and he held out his hand to me. "I can't believe it. Lawrence Kidder. I'm a consulting engineer at Continental Insurance. I've never met you in person, but I've read your work on dynamic load calculations in suspended structures. It's a classic, still used in university courses." I shook his hand, feeling the tension begin to subside, giving way to a strange lightness. "Thank you," I said. "It's nice to hear that the work didn't go to waste." I couldn't. "Didn't go to waste?" Lawrence laughed. "Your methodology is the basis for half of today's calculations. I use it myself when I do risk assessments for bridge projects." Another man from the same group, younger, about 45, came closer, looking at me with interest. "Edgar Wolf? The one who worked on Chanakal?" he asked, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. "Yes, I consulted on that project," I replied, trying to be modest without bragging. "It's a legend in our industry." The man turned to the other guests, who were now all standing in silence, listening to the conversation. "This man saved the Turkish bridge from disaster. He found a critical error in the calculations when most of the structure had already been built. If not for him, The bridge might have collapsed after a few years of operation. I heard a few people aghast, glancing around. Clive stood in the same place, pale as a sheet, his face frozen. Priscilla glanced back and forth at me and her husband, clearly not understanding what was happening. Lawrence turned to Clive. Clive, do you know this man? Edgar Wolf is one of the most respected figures in the engineering community. Anyone who works with major bridge projects knows his name. Clive opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally, he got it out. That's my father. There was silence, absolute silence, in which I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, someone's stifled breathing, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. People were looking at me and Clive, trying to digest this information. Your father? Lawrence asked slowly, as if he couldn't believe his own ears. Edgar Wolf is your father, and you never mentioned it? Clive was silent, clutching his glass so tightly I feared it would burst in his hands. A woman in her 50s, standing nearby, elegant, with a short haircut, came closer, looking at me with obvious interest. Mr. Wolf, I'm Nora Hutton, an architect with Stanford and Associates. I heard you speak at a conference in Boston about 10 years ago. You talked about the interaction of wind loads with cable-stayed systems. It was brilliant. Thank you, I nodded at her. I'm glad the presentation was memorable. Another man, a thick man with bushy eyebrows, approached our growing group. Archie Blaylock, valuation engineer. He introduced himself, extending his hand. I read your article in the Journal of Bridge Engineering 2 years ago about analyzing metal fatigue in old structures. We used your findings to evaluate the Dayton Street Bridge. I shook hands, answered questions, feeling a circle of people forming around me who knew my name, my work, my contributions to the industry. They talked about my articles, the projects I'd been involved in, the techniques I'd developed. They asked about Sonicale, how exactly I had found the error, what calculations I had used, how I had convinced the Turkish engineers to make changes. I answered calmly, without excessive modesty, but also without boasting, just telling the facts. I told them that I had noticed a discrepancy in the safety factors, that I had recalculated the loads taking into account local wind conditions, that I had suggested strengthening the anchors and adding dampers. They listened attentively, nodded, asked clarifying questions, and I saw in their eyes respect, sincere professional interest. And Clive stood aside, leaning against the wall, pale and motionless as a statue. Priscilla came up to him, whispered something in his ear, but he didn't react, just stared straight ahead with a blank stare. I could see him from the side, but I tried not to look at him directly, didn't want it to look like triumph or revenge, though to be honest, that was the feeling growing inside, the satisfaction that he'd finally seen the truth. Lawrence turned to Clive, still not believing what was happening. Clive, I don't understand. Your father is Edgar Wolf, a man quoted in textbooks, a bridge-building legend, and you've never, not once, mentioned that? We've been working together for 3 years, and I didn't even know. Clive finally moved, set his glass down on the nearest table with a trembling hand. Yeah, I didn't know he started hoarsely, but his voice trailed off. You didn't? Archie asked incredulously. Owen, how could you not know that your father was such an important figure in our industry? I decided to intervene, not wanting the situation to become completely humiliating for Clive. After all, he was my son, and as hurt as I was by what he'd said yesterday, I didn't want to completely destroy his reputation with his colleagues. We don't see each other much, I said calmly. My son has his own life, his own worries. I don't talk much about my work in the family circle. Lawrence nodded, but there was still a look of confusion in his eyes. Still, he said, it's a source of pride to have a father like that. If I were Clive, I'd tell everyone. Clive jerked as if he'd been struck. Priscilla took him under her arm tightly, as if she was afraid he was going to fall. Nora turned to me with a smile. Yep. Mr. Wolf, are you still consulting on projects, or are you on a well-deserved vacation? I'm still consulting, I replied. I recently received a proposal from Seattle, a project for a bridge over the bay. I will consider it soon. $350,000 in fees? Lawrence asked with a chuckle. That's about what they pay for that kind of consulting. Roughly, I confirmed, and I heard someone whistle softly. Clive stood there, and I watched his world fall to pieces. Everything he'd thought about me, All the notions he'd lived with for so many years, all of it was a lie, an untruth he'd made up for himself because he hadn't bothered to ask, to clarify, to find out the truth. The conversation moved smoothly from general greetings to professional topics, and I felt the atmosphere in the room change. Those who had been standing in the distance began to move closer, listening to the conversation. The party that had been organized in Clive's honor was now revolving around me, and I could see it happening as the attention of the guests gradually shifted from the host to the uninvited guest in the expensive suit. Lawrence asked me to tell more about the story of Chanakal, and I did not refuse. I spoke calmly, measuredly, explaining the technical side of the matter in a way that would be understandable to everyone, not just engineers. I told how I had been invited to the final stage of the project, how I had spent several days studying drawings and calculations, how I had noticed a discrepancy in the formulas used to determine the strength of the main span anchors. The problem was not with the design itself, I explained, but with the fact that the calculations did not take into account the specific local wind conditions. The Dardanelles Strait creates unique air currents that can cause resonant vibrations of the suspension structure under a certain combination of factors. The safety factor was underestimated by about 30%. And what would have happened if you hadn't noticed that? Nora, the architect, asked, looking at me with genuine interest. Nothing for the first few years, I replied. The bridge would have worked fine under normal loads. But after 5 to 7 years of operation, when the material would have accumulated fatigue damage in high winds and heavy traffic, the fasteners could have failed. The consequences would have been catastrophic. Several people looked at each other. I could see how they envisioned the picture. A bridge collapse over 2 kilometers long, cars falling into the water, casualties. Archie, the engineering estimator, shook his head. How long did it take to convince the Turkish contractors to make the changes? Usually at this stage of a project, any adjustments are met with resistance. About 2 weeks of negotiations, I grinned, remembering those tense meetings. They resisted because the corrections delayed the opening of the bridge by 4 months and required an additional cost of about $50 million. But I showed them the calculations, gave them examples of similar situations at other sites, and explained how much damage, both financial and reputational, they would suffer in the event of an incident. And they agreed. Lawrence nodded. Because you're Edgar Wolf, and your word in this area weighs more than the opinions of 10 other consultants. I didn't argue with that statement, even though it sounded a little high-minded. But what really mattered in the professional community was who exactly was pointing out the problem. My name carried weight. My calculations were not questioned because I had decades of work under my belt without a single serious error. A middle-aged woman I hadn't noticed before approached our group with a glass in her hand. "Pardon me for intruding," she said, "but I can't help but ask. Mr. Wolf, how much do you normally charge for a consultation of this caliber? Unless it's a secret, of course." I hesitated for a second. It wasn't appropriate to talk about money at a party, but she'd asked, and it would be strange to refuse. "Depends on the scope of the project," I answered cautiously. "Chanakal cost the Turkish government $400,000 for my consultation, plus a limousine as a gift," I grinned, "which I drove today." "A limousine?" Archie asked, raising his eyebrows. "The black one out front? Is that a gift from the Turkish government?" "Yes," I confirmed. "They insisted. They said it was a symbol of their gratitude for saving the national project." A few people laughed, some shook their heads approvingly. I saw people looking at me with respect, with admiration even, and it was pleasant, I won't hide it. After yesterday's humiliation on the porch of this house, it was balm on the wounds. Lawrence turned to Clive, who was still standing against the wall, pale and silent. "Clive, did you really not know about all this? About your father's work? About his reputation?" Clive jerked as if he'd been electrocuted. He pushed himself off the wall, straightened up, tried to smile, but it was strained and fake. "Of course I knew," he said, his voice sounding hoarse. "It's just, Dad was always a modest man, didn't like to publicize his accomplishments. I respected his desire to stay in the shadows. I looked at him, at his attempt to salvage the situation, and I felt a cold anger rise up inside. He's lying. Lying right now, in front of everyone. trying to get out of it, to rewrite history, to pretend he knew the truth all along, and just kept quiet out of respect for my modesty. It's an interesting theory, I said quietly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. Clive looked up at me, a flicker of fear in his eyes. Sokosan, what do you mean, Dad? He asked, trying to keep his tone casual, but I could hear the tension in every word. I paused, looking around the room. Everyone was looking at us. Lawrence, Nora, Archie, the rest of the guests, even those standing in the far corners of the room had fallen silent and turned in our direction. Priscilla froze next to Clive, clutching his hand, her face tense. I noticed Roxy, my granddaughter, standing by the stairs, apparently having come down from her room at the noise of voices. She looked at me with wide-open eyes. I mean, I said, looking Clive straight in the eye, that 2 hours ago you threw me off the doorstep of this house, told me to get out because I'd, and I quote, embarrass you in front of everyone. Told me I was a simple man who spent my life building bridges on construction sites and living modestly. You were ashamed of me, Clive. You didn't want your coworkers to see your working-class father. There was absolute silence. So silent that I could hear someone swallow, the floorboards creaking under someone's foot, the clock on the mantelpiece ticking. Everyone was looking at Clive, waiting to see what he would say, how he would respond to this accusation. Clive opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His face went from pale to red, and spots appeared on his neck, on his forehead. Dad, it's a misunderstanding, he began, but his voice shook. I didn't kick you out. I just said that the party was going on, that it was inconvenient. You told me to look at myself, I interrupted him, not raising my voice but enunciating each word clearly and firmly. Iris told me that I'd arrived in a cab, in a plain shirt, with some kind of box, that there were important people inside, engineers and architects, people who work with projects worth billions, and that I wasn't fit for their society. Priscilla went pale, her hand unclenched, letting go of Clive's arm. Roxy covered her mouth with her palm, her eyes full of terror. Lawrence looked at Clive with an expression that was close to disgust. "Oh, come on, Clive," he said slowly. "Is it true? Did you really kick your own father out of the house?" Clive stood there, opening and closing his mouth like a beached fish. There were no words, no excuses. The lies crumbled like a house of cards, and he was left alone with the truth, which was there for all to see. I didn't mean to," he mumbled. "I thought that you thought I was a construction worker," I finished for him calmly. "Because once, years ago, I told you I build bridges, and you took it literally. You thought your father was hauling rebar and mixing concrete, and never, not once in all these years did you bother to ask, to clarify, to find out exactly what it is I do. You just lived with your performance and were ashamed of me." Nora turned away, shaking her head. Archie stared at the floor, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. The other guests stood still, some looking at me sympathetically, some looking at Clive with judgment. Priscilla stepped forward, trying to take control of the situation. "Mr. Wolf," she began in a social tone that sounded false in the silence, "there may have been a misunderstanding. Clive has been very busy with the party preparations. Perhaps he did not express himself properly." "There was no misunderstanding," I said, looking at her. "Your husband told me in plain language that I would embarrass him by my presence, asked me to leave before anyone saw me. I left then because I didn't want to make a scene, but then I thought, why should I be ashamed of who I am? Why should I hide?" Roxy came closer. I could see tears streaming down her face. She looked at her father, at me, at the guests, and there was shame and incomprehension in her eyes. "Grandfather," she whispered, "I didn't know. I really didn't know that you were so famous," I prompted gently. "Successful? Respected in a professional environment?" "Yes, Roxy. Your grandfather isn't the poor old man you borrow money from for textbooks. Your grandfather is a man who saved a multi-billion-dollar project and gets paid more for his consulting than your father makes in a year." Clive jerked as if I'd hit him. Priscilla grabbed his arm, trying to hold him back, but he pulled away, taking a step toward me. "Enough," he breathed out. "Stop humiliating me in front of everyone. You proved your point. You've shown how great you are and how insignificant I am. Happy? I looked at him, at his red face, at his trembling hands, at his eyes full of tears and fury, and I felt emptiness. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a deep, dreary emptiness. I didn't mean to humiliate you, I said quietly. I wanted you to see the truth. I wanted you to realize who you threw off your doorstep yesterday. Lawrence cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. I think maybe we should give you two some time alone, he began, turning to Clive. But Clive shook his head sharply, nervously. No, the party's going on. It's all right. Just a family misunderstanding. His voice sounded strained, fake, and it was clear that no one believed what he was saying. The atmosphere of the party was spoiled. The conversations did not resume. The guests stood in small groups, looking at each other, whispering. I stood in the center of the living room, feeling dozens of stares, and realized that it was time to leave. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to be shown had been shown. There was no point in staying any longer. The party was ruined. The party atmosphere was ruined, and my presence only added to the awkwardness of the situation. I set my bag on the nearest table, started pulling out bottles and gift bags. Lawrence approached first, and I handed him one of the bottles. Thank you for recognizing me, I said quietly. It was nice to talk to someone who understood the work. Lawrence took the gift, shook my hand for the second time that evening. It's my great pleasure, Mr. Wolf, he said gravely. I'm sorry about this. I nodded, not answering. Nora came next, and I handed her the bottle, and she accepted it with a grateful smile. Archie, then the woman who'd asked about royalties, then the other guests one by one. I handed out gifts silently to anyone who approached, and people took them, thanked me, some shook my hand, said something nice about my work, my contribution to the industry. Clive stood against the wall, leaning against it, and watched the scene with a stopped look. Priscilla was beside him, holding his hand, whispering something, but he didn't react, just watched his guest take gifts from his father, whom he had kicked off the doorstep 2 hours ago. Roxy stood aside, wiping her tears with the back of her hand as she looked at me and at her father. Confusion on her face, confusion about how to live with that knowledge. When I handed out the last bottle, I put down my empty bag, hung it on my arm, and headed for the exit. A few people escorted me out with looks, some nodded goodbye, some averted their eyes. I walked through the living room to the hallway that led to the entryway, and I heard silence behind me. No one was talking, just standing there staring at me. I reached the hallway, stopped at the mirror, adjusted my tie, smoothed my jacket. I looked at my reflection, a tired face, eyes with shadows under them. But my back was straight, shoulders straight. I looked like a man with dignity, like a man who hadn't let himself be humiliated permanently. I opened the door, stepped out onto the porch. The night air was fresh and cool, and I breathed in a full breath, feeling the tension begin to subside. The limo was where I'd left it, black and shiny under the streetlights. I walked down the steps and headed for the car, pulling my keys out of my pocket. Dad, wait! I stopped, turned around. Clive had run out of the house before he could grab his jacket, standing on the porch in just his shirt, his arms wrapped around himself from the cold. His face was red, his eyes glistening, whether from tears or fury, I couldn't tell. Dad, please wait, he said again, coming down the steps toward me. I need to explain. I didn't know. I really didn't know who you were, what you were doing. I thought. He stopped talking, looking up at me from below. I was standing on the walkway, he on the bottom step of the porch. In the lamplight, I could see every wrinkle in his face, every detail of his expression, fear, desperation, trying to find the words that would fix everything. You thought I was a construction worker, I finished for him calmly, a man who carries heavy loads and lives from paycheck to paycheck, a man to be ashamed of in front of his successful colleagues. Cherish, I didn't mean to hurt you. Clive stepped forward, reaching out as if he wanted to touch me, but I didn't move, and his hand hung in the air. It's just, you were always so quiet, so modest, never talked about your work, never bragged about your accomplishments. I've seen you live in an ordinary house, no luxuries, no car. I thought you just didn't have anything to live on. Did it occur to you to ask? I looked at him, and there was no anger in my voice, just tiredness. In all these years, Clive, you've never once asked me directly what exactly I do, what it means to design bridges, how much I earn, what my reputation is in the professional world. You just drew a conclusion based on what you saw and lived with that conclusion without checking it. Clive lowered his hand, averted his gaze. I didn't care, he exhaled softly. I didn't care who you worked for, what you did. I lived my life. You lived yours. We hardly saw each other, hardly talked. What did it matter what you did? Exactly, I nodded. You didn't care. Until I showed up on your doorstep and threatened your reputation. That's when it became important to you who I was. Not because I was your father, but because I could embarrass you in front of important people. That's not true, Clive argued, but his voice sounded unconvincing. It's exactly like that, I shook my head. You didn't know because you never asked. Because all you cared about was how I looked from the outside. Simple clothes, cab rides, a modest lifestyle. To you, it was a sign of poverty and failure. You didn't think that a person could live simply by choice, not by necessity, that a man could have money and not flaunt it. Clive stood silent, his shoulders slumped, his head down. I looked at him and felt a strange mixture of pity and detachment. This was my son, the boy I'd raised, the boy I'd loved despite the distance between us. But in that moment, he seemed like a stranger, someone I didn't know or understand. What am I supposed to do now? Clive asked quietly, staring at the ground. How do I live with this? Everyone has seen it. Everyone has heard it. Tomorrow it'll be the talk of the office. In a week, the whole town will know. I've become a laughingstock. I grinned, without joy, without gloating. That's what you're thinking, I said. Not about hurting your father, not about losing touch with him, not about living so many years in delusion. It's about what people will say, about your reputation. And you think only of yourself, Clive burst out, raising his head. You came here, ruined my party, humiliated me in front of everyone. For what? For revenge? To prove how great you are and I'm nothing? I came, I said slowly, mouthing each word, to show you the truth, to show you exactly who you kicked off your doorstep 2 hours ago. This isn't revenge, Clive. It's justice. He was staring at me, his breath coming in quick gasps, his hands clenched into fists. I could see him struggling with his emotions, trying to find the words that would change everything, make everything right. But there were no such words. What had happened today could not be taken back, could not be forgotten or rewritten. Dad, he started again, but I held up my hand, stopping him. That's enough, I said tiredly. It took me 72 years to realize one simple thing. You can't earn the love of someone who just doesn't want you. You didn't love me, Clive. Maybe once when you were little, but not now. You shamed me, you avoided me, you kept me at a distance, and I'm not going to try and change that anymore. I turned around, walking toward the limo. Clive took a step to follow, but stopped, hesitant to go any further. So what now? He shouted back at me. You're just going to leave? We're not going to see each other again? I stopped in front of the car, turned around, looked at him one last time. I don't know, I answered honestly. Maybe someday, when you realize you were wrong, when you don't care about my status or my money, but just the fact that I'm your father, if that ever happens. I got in the limo, closed the door, started the engine. I looked in the rear-view mirror. Clive was standing in the driveway, a small figure in the streetlight, lonely and lost. I pulled out of the driveway, drove down the street away from his house, and didn't look back again. The drive home passed in silence. I drove automatically, hardly thinking about the road. My thoughts were far away. I remembered the evening, the faces of the guests, the conversations, the moment Lawrence recognized me. Clive's face when the truth was revealed, his words on the path, his attempts to justify himself. I arrived home around 2 in the morning, drove the limo into the garage, closed the gate, went into the house through the back door, went up to the bedroom, took off my suit, hung it back in the closet, put on his home clothes, went down to the kitchen, put the kettle on, took his favorite cup out of the cupboard, brewed some strong black tea. He took the cup, walked to the living room, sat in the chair by the window, the same one where he had read the letter from Seattle 2 days ago. It seemed like it had been forever since then. I drank my tea in small sips, staring out the window at Fitchburg at night. The city was asleep. The lights in the windows of the houses were out. Only the street lights shone with a soft yellow light. Quiet, still, peaceful. My phone vibrated in my pants pocket. I pulled it out, looked at the screen, Clive. It rang again, the second time in the last 10 minutes. I looked at the name on the screen, at the picture that popped up next to it, an old photo of him and me standing together at some party, smiling for the camera. I hit the reset button, went into settings, blocked his number. The phone went silent again. The screen went blank. I put it on the table next to the cup. I sat in the chair, finishing my tea, and thought about how I felt. I expected anger, triumph, the satisfaction of revenge. But inside there was only emptiness. A deep, quiet emptiness that didn't hurt or delight, it just was. And freedom. A strange, unfamiliar freedom from the weight of expectations, from trying to be liked, from wanting to fix what hadn't been fixed in years. I no longer had to try to earn my son's love. I no longer had to prove my worth to him. I was free from this endless chase for approval that never came. I finished my tea, set the cup on the table, and leaned back in my chair. I looked out the window at the sleeping city, at the dark sky, where rare stars peeked between the clouds. I thought about tomorrow, about the letter from Seattle, about the new project that awaited me. Thought about the life that would go on, even without Clive in it. And that was okay. It was the right thing to do. It was my life, and I had the right to live it with dignity, without anyone shaming me or making me feel less than I was. I closed my eyes, listening to the silence of the house, the ticking of the clock, the distant noise of the occasional car on the street. I felt emptiness and freedom, and both were part of the same whole, part of a new beginning.